You can think of that today. Now, just the same thing happens today. We invade countries today all around the world, but they're not really a danger to us. We're told that they're a danger. The war was also unnecessary, and actually, because what could the president have done? The president could have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court and get a ruling on secession, and then he could determine. In fact, Justice Black had already given some rulings earlier on presidential powers, and John will talk about this later on, I believe. So, but the power, according to the Constitution, Article 3, Section 1, judicial power is invested in the Supreme Court. But yet the court did not get to weigh in on this at all. And the reason is, of course, because they knew that South Carolina's case was legally sound. Translate that today, unconstitutional executive orders abound from all presidents. It was also a constitutionally falsified war. So, Abraham Lincoln claimed in the July 4th speech that no state had ever been out of the Union. Well, as we've already talked about, the Union existed with only 9 states before Rhode Island and I think it was North Carolina. Yes, they were added in about 2 years later. So the Union could exist with 9 states, and it existed after the states were formed. The sovereignty, as we remember from the Treaty of Paris, went to the states, not to a national government. But yet, Lincoln claimed that the Union is older than any state, and in fact, it created them as states. One of the most blatant lies I've ever seen by a politician, and I've seen a lot, believe me. So, today, again, we have lies are told repeatedly to Congress. The one that always comes to mind with me is the 2002 National Intelligence Estimate, where the CIA told the federal government that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So I think most everybody in Washington knew that wasn't true at the time, but anyway, that's a diversion. So Lincoln passed this was Congress actually. On July 25th, 1861, they passed the Crittenden-Johnson Resolution. And basically what that did was it allowed the president to charge treason, declare the South or anybody in the South guilty, and inflict the punishment without due process. Well, that again is in direct violation of Article 1, Section 9, which states no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. And what I learned about bill of attainder, which I actually learned from John, and you're going to hear later, is that's exactly what it is. You can't charge somebody, declare them guilty, and impose a punishment on them without due process.
They're also still part of the Union, according to him.
Exactly, they're still part of the Union, and therefore subject to the constitutional rules. Thank you. So again, we pass resolutions today on outright false pretenses. But the Constitution violations go more than just a declaration of war. The President authorized the Union Army to make direct invasions onto cities and civilians. This happened in 1862 in Fredericksburg around December. It happened in July 1863 in Vicksburg, in 1864 in Petersburg. Now, these were not attacks on the Confederate Army. These were direct attacks by the Army into the civilian population of these cities. I think it was Burnside that invaded Fredericksburg, went slashing right through the city. They shelled Vicksburg civilians from the Mississippi River, and then in Petersburg they used a cannon, which was called the Dictator, and that threw mortar shells into the city randomly. Did this for months. So these were attacks on citizens. But Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution says that the government is supposed to protect each of them against invasion, not to invade them. So exactly opposite of what it says. Many of the Branch Davidians, today you can think about the Branch Davidians, Vicki Weaver, Ruby Ridge. Weaver was shot with holding the baby on her front porch by a federal sniper believed to be on her YouTube, and she was killed, shot dead from 100 yards away. Obviously, not a threat to the federal government while you're holding a baby on your porch. However, but think about the mentality of the guy who fired that bullet, who thought that she was, in fact, a threat to him. Think about the mentality that to go through that federal agent. On April 27, 1861, the president suspended habeas corpus. Gee, what does that mean? Basically, they can pretty much arrest and imprison anyone that you want at any time. So, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says that this power is designated to Congress, and the president, it's not a power that the right to suspend habeas corpus is a power that's granted to the Constitution. If you look in the Constitution, it's granted to the Congress. Congress has that power. The president does not have that power. But yet he exercises it anyway. Today we have citizens held against their will, a couple of them in Guantanamo. One was tortured in Abu Ghraib. So we have a lot of that, again, from this president. It's still going on today. Many people recognize what happened in the South and the severe constitutional violations, but most people forget about there were actually more constitutional violations in the North than in the South. They were more severe in the South. Very severe disruption here. But, for example, we're going to see here, for 30,000 Northerners who protested the invasion of the South were arrested and imprisoned without a trial. The 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments of the United States Constitution require the presentment of indictment, the right to confront witnesses, and a speedy trial by jury. I know John will probably talk more about this as well. So they were denied their rights. And again, another precedent set. Some of you might remember in 1942, FDR imprisoned a lot of the Japanese simply because they were Japanese. There was a suspension of free speech. Basically, about 200 editors, the entire North was denied free speech. 200 editors, publishers, journalists were locked up in prison for denying, for simply actually opposing the war. They were just carted off, and in jail. One of those was the grandson of Francis Scott Key. Francis Key Howard, who was a publisher in Baltimore, was arrested and in prison for years. And he wrote about what the irony of that whole thing when he was in prison at Fort McKinley in Baltimore. So again, as most people know, the 5th Amendment prohibits the abridging of the freedom of speech. And I was thinking about precedents today that basically, I remember in 2003, I don't know if y'all remember this, but the U.S. shelled the Basra Hotel in, if y'all remember that when Saddam Hussein's statue was, the Iraqis supposedly brought down that statue over there. Well, that was a staged event. And the Al Jazeera was filming that, and there was nobody there except this one or two Iraqis that they had gotten the military brought in to tear the statue down. And if you take the video from the top of the Basra Hotel, you can see what happened, that it was a staged event. So that was why the U.S. government, your tax money, shell that hotel. We literally fired shells into the hotel to get the cameras off the top so they wouldn't be able to tell America that that was a phony event. They confiscated citizens' arms in the state of Missouri. John Fremont, who actually ran for president before Abraham Lincoln, said that he was going to, if anyone was found with an arm in the state of Missouri, that they were going to be shot on the spot. Well, the Second Amendment gives the people the right to bear arms. So that was also a violation of the Constitution. They literally were serious about threatening the people and killing them. So we have a variety of these laws today, banning gun ownership and a variety of different acts I think we're all familiar with. There was confiscation of personal property, July 1861, 1862. There was the confiscation, perhaps one of the most famous pieces of confiscated property is that of Mariana Lee Custis in Arlington Heights. When those 14,000 troops came across Alexander and Arlington, they took control of Robert E. Lee's and Mariana Lee Custis' property, and they never gave it back. They stole that property, and that property today is where the Pentagon sits and where the Arlington National Cemetery resides. So understand that every soldier, every American soldier buried in Arlington National Cemetery is buried on property that was stolen from the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. Today, we have federal asset. The U.S. Justice Department has a whole federal asset forfeiture division. They can come and get your stuff whenever they want, without due process. Fifth Amendment says that you can't do that. Private property cannot be taken for public use in compensation. They tried to redistribute property. Sherman's Special Order 15, which was eventually withdrawn, basically stated that they wanted to transfer property that are from legitimate owners who did not use it in time of war, transfer that to some of the slave population. But Article 3, Section 3 says that you can't have a tender of treason that will, except during the life of the person that's detained. So in other words, you can't take their personal property away and give it, that there's an inheritance there for the descendants, and that would be unconstitutional as well. Today, the Justice Department sells those assets and never returns them to the owners, the rightful owners, even without due process. Here's another doozy for you. Elections were suspended in the states of Missouri, Maryland, extreme tampering in Delaware by the Union troops. Federal troops arrested and imprisoned 30 Maryland legislators to prevent them from seceding. See, the state of Maryland was going to secede because they did not want to be a part of the war. Their people were protesting. They were actually, the Maryland citizens attacked the Union Army when they came through and actually inflicted the first casualties. So they wanted to succeed, but so the Lincoln administration had the legislators who favored secession arrested to prevent Maryland from seceding. Now, why would he do that? Well, think about where D.C. is. Yeah, D.C. was on property given to the national government by Maryland, and as Dr. Bill alluded to here, if Maryland had succeeded, Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded by the Confederacy, and Lincoln would have had to move the capital to Philadelphia. So it's better to violate the rights of all the people in the state of Maryland in order to preserve the location of the capital. I guess that was the thinking there. Again, Article 1, Section 4 prescribes that the time, place, and manner for conducting elections is the jurisdiction of the state, not of the national government. As y'all know, CIA goes around the world, military removing this dictator and that dictator, and replacing them with one of our dictators. So, same kind of things that we're tampering with elections worldwide on a grander scale. April 22, 1861, federal troops imposed martial law in the state of Baltimore. The mayor of Baltimore was arrested. The police commissioners of Baltimore were arrested. And they tried to protect the Union Army when they came through. They were, the governor was a Unionist. They did their best, and yet these people were arrested, imprisoned without a trial. Again, Article 3, Sections 1 and 2. All judicial power. All the crimes, except for the case of impeachment, were tried by jury. They never got a jury trial. Even the mayor of Baltimore didn't get a jury trial. We have imposed martial law 4 times. I looked at from 1892 to 2005, the last one being in Hurricane Katrina. Military tribunals existed. Mary Surratt was the first woman. This was after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Mary Surratt was arrested and found guilty by a military tribunal, which was actually split. Many of the people on the tribunal did not think that she was guilty. The problem there was that while she knew John Wilkes Booth and they were in her boarding house, and she did run an errand for Booth on the day of the assassination. There's no evidence that she actually knew that Booth was going to shoot the president that day. So, nevertheless, she was still convicted and the first woman hung in the United States of America. Again, and that was in violation to the 6th Amendment of the Constitution, which requires an impartial jury. So, we had a few more things I want to cover. Forced military service. Congress passed the Enrollment Act on March 3, 1863. And that required, as the Confederacy as well, that required a person to serve in the military, but yet the 5th Amendment says that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness without due process. So there's no due process that they wanted not to serve. And of course, we carried that draft through World War I, World War II, Korea, and the Vietnam War, still forced military service. Deportation of adversaries. A former congressman was deported because he did the opposition piece. You know how you do the opposition speech when the president of the State of the Union? Well, this congressman from Ohio did the opposition speech after the president's State of the Union address and was arrested by the Union Army in the middle of the night and taken away. A similar thing happened recently back with Bobby Kennedy when he deported Carlos Marcello, just picked him up and threw him out of the country and dropped him out of a plane. And Marcello was a mafia head, but even a mafia head deserves due process in America. All right, here now we're getting a couple more things that are close to your heart, and then we're just about wrapped up with this section. To help fund the war, Congress passed the Revenue Act. This was the first income tax. Well, the problem with that was it was unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 10 says that the representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among several states, shall be included within the Union according to their respective numbers. So, in other words, there's a direct tax from the national government to the people was unconstitutional. And in fact, it was found to be unconstitutional in 1895. They then made it constitutional, supposedly in 1913. However, I have never, no one can produce the ratification documents for the 16th Amendment.
That's right.
There's a great book called There Ought to Be a Law. I'm sorry, The Law That Never Was. Bill Benson and Red Beckman, they went around the country to look at, went to every state to find the ratification documents of the 16th Amendment. Only about 3 states actually ratified that in the exact form as the United States Constitution requires. So it's very questionable, but that was imposed probably by Philander Knox and falsified, as was most likely the 17th, but that's a different story. So the federal tax rate started there at 0.5% in 1913. It rose to 88% money over $100,000 in 1979. Just absolutely runaway control. 1.5% to 88%. As many of you know, the government started printing fiat money. These were called greenbacks. Again, and once again, in violation of the Constitution, which says that the right to emit bills of credit, gold and silver, and so on, goes to the Constitution. This fiat money was created as greenbacks, and the Confederacy did this as well. So this leads to mass inflation, as I know most of you here know, and the Federal Reserve is an example of that today in 1913, and it's carried that present on. There were unauthorized treaties. Here's a treaty that you may not be aware of. So, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, was Abraham Lincoln signing a treaty to emigrate slaves to other countries. He was trying to immigrate the black population out of America, not immigrate I-M-E-M. But again, Article 2, Section 2 requires the advice and consent of the Senate to do that. GATT and NAFTA are examples of that violation. We talked about there was a military occupation of the Arlington House that we talked about, Mary Ann Lee Custis and her house. That is also in violation of the Third Amendment of the Constitution. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. Today we occupy entire countries, not just houses. There was a naval blockade, a 500-ship naval blockade, again, in violation of Article 1, Section 8 and 9 of the Constitution. As Dr. Bills alluded to, Lincoln considered that the South was still part of the Union, and therefore this too would have been a violation because they cannot regulate commerce in that manner and impose a partiality from one state over another. Finally, the last one is the secession of West Virginia. According to the Lincoln administration recognized West Virginia as a state. However, the United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 3, says that no new state can be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of another state. So West Virginia was in the jurisdiction of Virginia. Virginia did not agree to have those people secede, yet it was never recognized as a state. So that was also illegal. Finally, we have to consider whether or not all of these constitutional violations were a massive dereliction of duty. The President is sworn to uphold the oath of the United States Constitution. He obviously did not do that. We know that everybody in the room can take an example of a politician today that's not upholding the United States Constitution. All right. I apologize. That took a long time, but you have to understand the magnitude of the overthrow of the American government. 25 different violations. When you tabulate all this up, here are the constitutional violations. These are the number of people who were impacted by those violations. You come up with a grand total that is very, very close to 100 million constitutional violations. 100 million individual constitutional violations just in this 4 to 5 year period. So I wanted you to understand the magnitude of that. It was amazing to me. I just couldn't really believe it. So in order to get away with this, they need to have a cover story. In order to get away with what amounts to 100 million violations of the Constitution, you have to have a cover story. And the cover story was that this war was about slavery. Well, let's look at that. Only about 6% of the South owned slaves. And it's pretty obvious that the other 94% were not fighting for the rights of the 6 to own slaves. I mean, would you go out and fight for somebody else's right to own a slave? I don't think so. Jefferson Davis said it was about constitutional rights. Probably, I'll skip through this, you can read these. The soldiers' letters show that the South fought to defend their families. The North believed that they were fighting to preserve the Union. You can take a look at these and see, but probably the most important one I know that John will point out again is that when it came to ratification and the war was over, 8 of the 11 Southern states ratified the 13th Amendment, which was for slavery, right, to get rid of slavery. But 10 of the 11 refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, the U.S. Citizenship Amendment. Now, John's going to explain why. I know he's going to tell you all about that. Lincoln himself had racist comment after racist comment. We're told that he was wanting to free the slaves. When he talked about expanding the territories, he said that we want to keep them free for the houses of white people, and that was the objection. They didn't want to expand slavery into the states because they wanted white-owned territories out west. Lincoln said he wanted a separation of the white and black races. He says, I'm in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. I have no purpose directly or indirectly or interfere for the institution of slavery. Amazing comment. He said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. So Lincoln was equally the same. He had the same type of racism as many of the others at that time. But the actions go further. We want to talk about this for a minute. But first of all, we all have heard, they're still teaching ourselves in the kids in the school that the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves. As most of you know here, that the 13th Amendment was actually free the slaves, not the Emancipation Proclamation. Why didn't the Emancipation Proclamation free slaves? Well, first of all, it excluded all the northern states. So if you were in the north, you could keep whatever slaves you had. There was no problem there. It was ignored by the southern states because they were not under Union control. But it also excluded any southern territories that were being occupied by the North. So if the North occupied a territory, again, the North could keep the slaves. And probably most interesting is that it allowed all the southern states to keep their slaves if they came back to the Union within the 4-month period, which was the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in September of 1862. If the states came back before January 163, they could keep their slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation never really actually freed any slaves except possibly some in the D.C. area. Lincoln himself argued against the Illinois Constitution. He actually represented a slave owner in 1847. The slave owner was trying to reclaim his slaves, and he actually represented the slave owner, lost the case to the Illinois Supreme Court. He objected to General John Fremont's order. You remember John Fremont was going to shoot all those people who were having a gun. Well, he objected to the order, but only because the order said it was free slaves. He didn't have any objection. He said, I have no objection to the fact that you want what your order says about shooting the people with guns, but he objected that it was going to free some slaves. Likewise, he also avoided General Hunter's order. General Hunter tried to do the same thing, and he avoided that. Most importantly, the thing to remember that President Lincoln established a commissioner of immigration. This is E-M, not I-M, immigration, to attempt to colonize the American slaves in Haiti and other foreign countries. He was actually a key member of the American Colonization Society in Illinois, one of the chapter leaders or maybe even state leader. So his desire was to remove the black population from America, and he was even still attempting to do that in January of 1865, just before his death, when he approached General Butler and asked about this. And General Butler told him he didn't think it was feasible because now there were millions of slaves. So that was Lincoln's real view on slavery. So where did the idea of this war for slavery come about? Well, it was coined by none other than Karl Marx in a November 1864 letter where he coined the phrase, the American Anti-Slavery War. And from that point in time on, that is what generated the concept of this war from slavery. Now, Karl Marx was a guest columnist at Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. We'll talk about that in just a second. We're just about wrapping up here. But many of the Marxist revolutionaries came over from Germany. In the failed German Revolution, they came to America. Many settled in the Mideast. They settled in the Mideast. They were instrumental in getting Abraham Lincoln elected president of the United States. The book Lincoln über Alles points that out. A lot of them joined the Union Army. We have actually a dozen German Marxist generals in the Union Army. Now you might say, oh God, I don't believe that. Okay, here's the list. All of these people were commanders in the Union Army. Charles Dana, he was not a commander, but he was actually the Assistant Secretary of War. And he was the editor of Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, and he was the key person who got Karl Marx to come to America, to begin printing articles in America. The other one, Brigadier General Joseph Weidmeyer, was commissioned by Marx to publish the first American version of the Communist Manifesto in America in 1861. So, there were also Hungarians and Norwegians that were also coming from the European Marxist Revolution. So, still want more? Well, let's look at the doctrine, the Lincoln Doctrine, as we conclude and compare that. We've already talked about 24 different violations of the United States Constitution and 100 million of rights. It's obviously that this president had no regard for the Constitution of the United States of America. What did he regard? Well, if you look at the 10 key points